Дамы и господа, президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Путин.
Russia finally postpones the May 9th Victory Day celebrations as reality sets in. Vladimir Putin's approval rating craters as new COVID-19 cases increase for 6 consecutive days, and the virus spreads to every Russian region. And chaotic scenes unfold at the Moscow metro as the capital's digital pass system hits a snag. Russia's response to the unique coronavirus has left a lot to be desired, but let's face it, they aren't exactly alone in that department. But in a highly personalized and highly centralized system, the consequences there could be severe. Hello from my condo in Adams Morgan in Washington, D.C., where I am observing federal and local self-isolation guidelines in my makeshift studio. And welcome to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. And joining me from his home in Alexandria, Virginia, is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA, and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Don.
Hi, Brian. Nice to be back.
Nice to see you again. And also joining us from just down the street in DuPont Circle after escaping from Cleveland, Ohio, is Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome back, Maria.
Hello, everyone. Great to be back.
Great to have you back here in Washington. Hope you were fine there in Ohio. So the journalist and author Andrei Soldatov, a good friend of all of ours, had an interesting column this week that I think in a lot of ways summarizes and encapsulates Russia's response to the pandemic. Soldatov recapped the botched rollout of Moscow's digital pass system. Remember this QR pass system? The whole rollout was botched. The app had all sorts of problems. And there were fears initially that this app would give the authorities big brother-like surveillance capabilities. But the result was effectively long lines at the Moscow metro as police scanned the passes by hand. They put thousands of Muscovites in grave danger of becoming infected. And Andrei kind of saw this as kind of a whole metaphor for the response. He said a gradual, I'm quoting him now, a gradual acceptance of increased government control could possibly come true in 2020 in Moscow, but the authorities' sheer incompetence coupled with bureaucratic arrogance ruined that chance. Soldatov compared the scene at the Moscow metro to the aftermath of the Soviet authorities' response to the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. On May 1st, 1986, 4 days after the fourth reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant erupted, Soldatov writes, Kyiv held a massive May Day rally in the center of the city. Thousands and thousands of people were exposed to radiation as the wind brought more and more dust from the burning nuclear station. The decision by party officials to hold a mass rally was a manifestation of incompetence, criminal stupidity, and the Soviet regime's complete inability to make quick decisions. Even those Soviet citizens who were not very interested in politics in 1986 were shocked by the party's decision to conduct the mass rally despite the catastrophe. It completely destroyed trust in the Communist Party. Don, Maria, your thoughts? Is Andrei onto something here? I mean, there's a lot that's kind of showing that this centralized and personalized system is not well equipped to deal with this disaster and is not dealing with this disaster well. And granted, not many countries are right now, but in a centralized and personalized system, the stakes appear to be higher. Any thoughts on that?
Thank you for a great question, Brian. I would really love to share Andrei Soldatov's optimism. He's a great scholar.
You consider this optimism?
I think he's optimistic when he says that this is the end of the story, right? He suggests that it could have been 1984, but it totally failed. At least that was my reading of the article. To me, what we definitely see, where I'm definitely with Andrei in this article, is on sheer incompetence, coupled with the bureaucratic arrogance of Russia's ruling class. Definitely. But the problem is that is, again, nothing unusual if you look at Russia's history. It's very, known common saying in Russia that the rigor of Russian laws is substantively mitigated by lack of the lack of their enforcement or incompetent enforcement of those laws. So that actually has been historically a getaway for Russian people when certain laws have been passed and been quite restrictive. People, they were not enforced by the authorities or not competently enforced to the extent that it allowed some people to escape these laws. This is not necessarily new, but the problem is we don't see the authorities totally rejecting this option, right? Even if definitely Moscow authorities face a catastrophic image failures, and of course must have probably spread the disease now to many more people as a result of this failure to enforce the passes competently, doesn't mean that they're actually going to stop there. For example, the St. Petersburg governor is currently discussing introduction of the same passes in St. Peter as well. And in Moscow, at least I haven't heard anything about abolishing these passes either. Rather, they will probably now try to hopefully do it more competently. I definitely think that Russia's elites will use this opportunity and destruction of the public attention and the mass panic in Russia to try and to adopt more restricting authority. They will do that quite incompetently, and many people will suffer in this way, but we probably will come out of this crisis with the Russian state becoming even more, in essentially acquiring even more competencies and more authority than before.
Maria, if you were going to say that would have happened anyway, correct? That they're going to learn and the system will adapt.
No, that's done. I wanted to, actually I had a very interesting debate about that with my friends on Facebook. Essentially, they raised the same point. They told me this would have happened anyway. I don't think so. I don't think that would have happened absolutely 100%. I think there is a tiny little percent there that essentially accounts for all of the Russian civil society, mostly concentrated in Moscow, that we have tried to rebel, backlash against those policies under normal circumstances. But right now they're totally incapacitated because they're all stuck in their apartments. They can't even go out if they don't have a dog in the streets. And of course, there's no any kind of mass public protest in question to protest those limitations and restrictions of civic freedoms.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you. This is not, in many ways, not that different from what we talked about in January about cutting off the internet and that kind of thing. I just want to raise, Brian, I thought the comparison with Chernobyl was maybe a little forced and a little bit wishful thinking. There are the incompetence, the way this thing has been handled. There are things that are the same, but I think we should stop kind of rooting for something that will bring down the system.
Well, I don't see it as that. I see it more I'm looking at it as something that is damaging the legitimacy of the regime. Yeah. That is not to say the regime is going to fall. It's saying that the regime is losing its aura of invincibility. It's losing its aura of omnipotence. And this I think is the most damaging thing. And this is why a system like the Russian system with its highly centralized and highly personalized nature is, I think, potentially vulnerable to this. Again, with the caveat that does not mean it's going to fall.
And I think I would agree. And, we've had a series of these kind of, quote, accidents in the whole Putin era. The regime seems to have recovered. I think this is probably more serious, but I think a faulty nuclear reactor is different than a force majeure. But I agree with you, the quality of the response, and I mean that in quotes, does affect the perception of the regime, and I would agree there's damage been done, and it's not likely to go down for a while, if at all.
I mean, Tatiana Snegovaya also had an interesting piece this week where she said in its 20th year in power, the Putin regime is now facing the biggest challenge it ever faced in those 20 years. And if you want to compare them, the magnitude of Chernobyl, sure, this isn't as spectacular as Chernobyl, but the death toll is going to be higher. You know, that much is clear.
But again, to reinforce the point both of you are making, I think there's accumulation of, can we say, lack of competencies going on before this even happens, which we've talked about, the economy, the issue of mobilization, which Maria wrote a fine article about this week. There's accumulation of things that suggest that either the regime is weakening or has to go in a different direction. And I think that's what we talked about on the show back in January. So yeah, it's one more thing on the wheelbarrow, and that's different than a year ago.
I mean, I also wanted to kind of bring into this, I mean, the cancellation of, now this was predictable, they should be doing this is the right decision, it should have been made a month ago, but canceling the Victory Day celebrations, right? Now, that said, and this is absolutely the right thing to do otherwise would have been criminally negligent, but that Victory Day celebration is, I mean, as close to a civic religion as you have, you know, in Russia. This is the regime's like main legitimizing myth. And, you know, Putin's 2024 operation is effectively dead for the moment. I mean, how are they going to conduct an election in this, under these circumstances, or a referendum or a plebiscite? Right. So, I mean, it really is kind of throwing a wrench in the big meta things that this regime is supposed to be doing. And so, I mean, the ideological component of this regime is being punctured. And this regime is showing itself not very good at problem solving either. So when you have these two things, ideology and problem solving, and they're not showing an ability to do either right now. Democratic countries that are struggling with this will, I believe, recover from the damage, because that's what democratic societies do. It's expected that you have trial and error and checks and balances, and you know, so for all of those out there that are saying we're just criticizing the Russian response while the U.S. and other democratic countries aren't doing so well, yeah. But let's see let's see what the lessons learned are from this. Any thoughts on this? I mean, or am I wrong? Is Russia in saying that Russia is more vulnerable than in democratic societies?
I would definitely agree, Brian, that what this crisis has exposed, if it was not still clear to some Russians out there, is that the regime definitely is autocratic in the sense that it privileges primarily the groups, very narrow circle of the groups, of the elite groups that are closest to the Kremlin. As a matter of fact, just a couple of days ago, new Levada Center polling has come out, poll results that show that 38% of Russians think that Vladimir Putin expresses, backs the interests of the oligarchs, the bank directors of the bank, and the large entrepreneurs, actually, which nicely connects it to the second part of our research. But what it shows to you is that people are increasingly kind of aware that they are not overall on Putin's radar. Putin is not representative of someone who represents their interests, which is, believe it or not, actually contrary to his common image. Typically, he would try to portray himself as someone who connects with the people, right? These TV shows, direct lines, and he directly solves their issues. It's the bad oligarchs or bad elites who malfunction, but Putin is the one who typically solves the problem, directly connected to the people. He's the one who backs the ordinary people. That image is definitely being eroded by the crisis. This is already coming out in the polls, and it's most obvious, of course, in the state policies announced to back people throughout this crisis. This is to follow up, Brian, on your earlier point. How are democracies different? So you actually can measure that difference in money, I believe, in monetary way by estimating how much democracies back people, how much money they redistribute during this crisis, as opposed to Russia. Because Russia still, the Kremlin still resists actually any major monetary payments to the people. the policy remains more or less the same, where they create this list of strategic companies. And this list of strategic companies, who they're going to help. This list of strategic companies has already been met with huge resistance in Russia. A lot of people weren't happy. That's, of course, and of course, we know who's going to get on that strategic list. It's going to be Sechin, I don't know, well, Timchenko, Rotenbergs, etc., etc., etc. So, as a matter of fact, yesterday the authorities have announced that they won't have this list. What it really means is that they will not make it public anymore. So it's very clear that Putin is using, with a mosquito's term, very, very narrow electorate, this group of people who he really cares about. And the rest of the Russians are not important. And this definitely is becoming more obvious throughout this crisis. We will see the longer term effects of it. Of course, the regime is going to be more vulnerable. The question is, what does it mean? Does it mean that Putin will leave eventually?
There's been some pretty interesting humor out there about all of this. There was a joke making the rounds of Putin walks into a bar and says, "Hey, everybody, the drinks are on the house." And this is in reference to the paying of everybody's salaries, but not providing any money for the.
By the way, may I just jump in? The state TV channel actually.
Yes, I see.
Showed that joke, but of course, Putin name was replaced with Siluanov.
Well, the finance minister, exactly. And so this was, but the fact that even got onto state television, I thought was actually very telling. And speaking of humor, and Andrei Soldatov referenced this in his column this week. But when the problems with the app, with the QR codes was coming out, they were having trouble launching it. The official response was, well, there was some kind of DDoS attack on this. And then when the scenes at the metro came, they said, well, it appears the metro is now the subject of a DDoS attack. So the humor and the sheer cynicism that's coming out about this, I think, is something that we really shouldn't dismiss. Don, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I had a footnote question, I guess, for Maria, but either of you, which is to say, we've seen less of Sobyanin mania this week. And do you think this screw up at the Moscow metro will help him? Or is this perceived as a federal deal and he's separate from that?
That's a good question. I mean, I've been kind of looking and kind of tracking the knock-on effects that this is having. And one of the areas I'm looking at is in the Putin inner circle. And I right now, I interpret that Sobyanin did kind of take a hit for this.
Yeah.
Sobyanin was chosen for this job for his competence. And that was not a display of competence at all. Maria, I don't know.
Definitely, Don. Thank you a lot, and that's the point. That's actually what I was trying to, the point I was trying to make in my article for SIPA as well. A lot of observers were actually puzzled by this alleged federalization, quote unquote, that Putin accidentally pushed this responsibility for the crisis on the governors, on the regions. Right? And a lot of people, remember we even discussed that earlier, that why would he do that? That actually portrays him as someone who doesn't know how to handle the crisis, who kind of isolates himself from the responsibility. But that was exactly the point, to avoid major image failures like the one Sobyanin faced in Moscow with these horrible crowds in front of the metro. And that is gonna probably at least somewhat work in the future, because if we know anything about Russian politics, it's not the last major image problem that the Russian elites are going to be facing in managing this crisis. So yeah, and Putin consistently does it. It's not the first time he's done it. As I mentioned before, in 2012, for example, the so-called May decrees, which actually promised huge increase of redistribution to Russian people, is one of Putin's re-election promises, were actually again pushed on the regional level, and some levels actually, or some regions even went bankrupt, almost trying to deliver on those promises, which in the long run were only beneficial for Putin, not for the regional governors. That's the way the system works. So essentially, you now privatize all the benefits and you try to push all the costs on the regional levels.
I actually, Maria, this reminds me of, there was again, Tatiana Snegovaya had a great piece for Carnegie this week about what this is kind of doing to the aura of Putin and to the Putin mystique. And she writes, following Russia's annexation of Crimea, Putin ceased to be a politician and began to consider himself a historical figure. Politicians are held accountable, stand for elections, and are monitored. Historical figures are not held account or monitored. They legitimize themselves through their historical achievements. Under this approach, any irritation from society is seen as the result of mistakes by the figure's subordinates. That works as long as the historical figure can't activate the machinery of the state and that the state is responsive to this. And in this COVID-19 crisis, this is clearly becoming problematic. And this is how Tatiana concludes. There is no dialogue in Russia between society and the authorities. And the problem of the leadership deficit is not just managerial, but political. The state is becoming nothing more than a monitoring mechanism for coercion and is losing its legitimacy. In its 20th year, the Putin system is closing in on itself and self-isolating from society. The fight against the epidemic will continue, but its aim is not to protect people, but to be able to serve each individual managerial cog in the machine. Maria, react to that.
I 100% agree with Tatiana. I'm only surprised that she only just realized this being the case. I think that's only, at the very least, it's true of the Putin's regime for the last 15 years, at least the last 10 years.
Don?
I would agree with Tanya, too. As Maria said, we've talked about this many times, not just this year. I would note another footnote, guys, that the Chinese are concerned about the infection coming back across the border to infect and re-agitate the situation there. And again, Russia came late to all this. They're not handling it particularly well. I would be very curious to know what's going out in the regions and especially in the security services where we have very little information, except some peripheral comments on the May 9th postponement, Brian, as you said.
Yeah, no, I mean, we do know now that COVID-19 is in every single subject of the Russian Federation.
Yes.
Every single region. That we know. Where earlier on it was seen as this Moscow problem, and it was sparking all this anti-Moscow sentiment, and people were like telling Muscovites to stay away. I mean, this is natural. Moscow's a megapolis. This is, in huge population centers. This is where pandemics always break out, first in large quantities. So we have large clusters of people, and it only stands to reason that sooner or later it's gonna move to the rest of the country.
I'm curious, but guys, if there are governors standing out in how they're handling this outside the capital, and there's just not enough information.
You mean other than Kadyrov, who's basically
yeah. Other than
full on crazy?
Other than the crown prince. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, another thing I'm interested in is the knock-on effects of this in many different ways, and we've talked about Sobyanin. Igor Sechin, the CEO of Rosneft. Now, this is very indirect and knock-on, but as a result of COVID, the oil glut was exacerbated, and it stood to reason that Russia should have joined into the OPEC plus deal to cut production in order to prop up the global price. Sechin, though, and this is all coming out now, that this was Sechin's thing was, hey, let's use this to really put the screws to American shale producers and put them out of business by driving the price down. And in the process drove the price down. The Saudis increased production. And Russia was forced to capitulate last week on this. And got a much worse deal than they would have to begin with. And there's a lot of speculation in the press that this was going to hurt Sechin politically. There was a very critical piece that was supposed to be published in Viedomosti last week, which was pulled by the publisher. Maria, I don't know, you're nodding. Did you follow that whole?
Yes, Konstantin Sonin wrote this piece. He's a regular contributor to Viedomosti for the last probably already 15, 20 years, and also a great economist. He actually is employed at Chicago University. I have to say that the piece wasn't that critical, honestly. I thought it was...
it was if you read between the lines
critical.
in a kind of Soviet press way.
But it definitely shows you, first of all, Viedomosti Vedomosti has just been sold again to new owners whose stance is quite pro-Kremlin, and so everyone kind of already said rest in peace to what used to be a great, fantastic business publication. I used to be there myself, a biweekly columnist for at least 3-4 years. And unfortunately, we just see that Sechin, if anything, that actually demonstrates you the fear that Sechin spreads around until now. So even if he's going to be weakened at some point, we're not there yet, because the major outlets like Vedomosti actually are afraid to put out something that's even mildly critical to him. I would wait and see. Sechin has survived far worse situations in the past. Just a reminder, in 2014, Rosneft, as a result of the sanctions, created the crisis in the Russian economy, where actually ruble lost half of its value to dollar in December 2014. Again, was primarily a crisis driven only by Rosneft and Sechin's actions, but again, he survived until now. We will see, and once again, this is directly going back to Tatiana Snegovaya's piece. This is directly relevant to the point that it's very unclear what at this point the Russian elite should do for them to really piss off Putin. Because as the regime becomes more older and older, and definitely lose any relation, any feedback to the society, it tends to be entrenched in its own opinions, and who knows what the Russian elites are actually thinking about this crisis. Typically, whatever happens, these former security officers tend to imagine as some kind of secret plot driven by the United States against them. So whatever happens, they tend to interpret that in a very different way. So we'll have to wait and see what kind of what does it mean in terms of Sechin's longer-term survival.
Don, would you agree
If
with
anything, the virus crisis, Brian and Maria, may have diverted attention from the Sechin shenanigans more than it deserved. And I would add that, of course, he's been playing around with the Venezuelans for a long time, too. So it's not a healthy role, as they used to say. And I do think this is hurting him badly in the elite, yes. But as Maria said, he's recovered before, and he has a way of getting his way on what he wants.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the big $1 million question hanging over all of this is like, is this just another crisis that they'll weather, or is this something much, 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 much bigger? And I don't know yet, although there's something in me saying that this is possibly the latter. I mean, like I said, we are all going to come out of this changed. It's not going to be the same America when this is all said and done. It's not going to be the same Europe, and it's not going to be the same Russia. In a lot of ways, I think we are going through something truly historic and unprecedented. Maria, since you're our polling expert, I came across an interesting poll published by RBC this week. It was conducted by Online Market Intelligence and the platform Social Center. 56% of respondents said they did not trust official information about COVID-19. 56%. 29% believe the authorities underestimate the real number of cases. Now, 60% said they trust or partially believe the information that that their own personally familiar doctors tell them. Does that, as somebody that looks at a lot of polls, do those numbers surprise you?
I'm actually glad that Russians respond very rationally to these realities. Once again, we have to be careful with directly making political implications based on this data, because Putin's rating is something different from how people perceive the reality typically. So definitely among my friends, my colleagues, everyone I talk to, there is zero trust in the official data. First, of course, the authorities, as happened also in the United States, kind of try to mitigate the situation. Then of course, also based on the past experience, no one actually trusts the authorities to be honest about communicating the bad news. Then finally, they started testing, but tests are also not very reliable. We talked that they're probably less sensitive, so they're probably missing a lot of real cases, a lot of evidence reports on that. And then we also actually get a very interesting situation where there is a lot of tests that have been run allegedly by Russia. Russia right now already is in the top of, actually reaching the top of the list on the number of tests run and the number of cases discovered. But the problem is that no one knows whether those tests, with those millions of tests, have been run. And there is a lot of jokes going around about that. Apparently the elites are testing, are paranoid and testing themselves again and again and again because the tests are so unreliable. And this is how we probably got the million of tests. So everyone who lives in Russia understands the situation and that you shouldn't be trusting whatever the official media says. However, unfortunately, there is also this tendency to kind of support the authorities no matter what. Partly it's a Soviet legacy of, supporting the official, the party, despite you are understanding that it's lying and not representing reality well. So we will see how this communicates, how that translates into the image of Putin, that the ratings will suffer as a result of this crisis. There's no doubt about that. What I doubt is whether there's going to be some fundamental longer-term consequences that will alternate the political landscape in Russia.
Does that 56% number of those that mistrust the official information coming from the authorities, does that sound right to you? Or do you think it's higher or lower?
Question already, if you remember, so unfortunately I don't have the data in front of me, but already back in September, we saw this very harsh polarization among the people who watched TV and those who rely primarily on internet for news. And already there, the split was about 30% versus 30%. So I'm not surprised that the number of people who become more skeptical about the official TV channels or official Kremlin channels is growing, because once again, there's a lot of evidence that people observed where they didn't think that the authorities acted promptly enough, and this just exacerbated the trends that already existed in the society before. This growing polarization between people who rely on internet for main news and those who rely on federal TV channels, actually, it has just been deepened. As pretty much everywhere in the world, I want to say that this pandemic does not necessarily fundamentally alternate this dynamic, but it does definitely accelerate the political and social dynamic that was already on the ground before.
Well, that's interesting because before this pandemic, we were talking a lot about the shifting public opinion on this podcast with you, Maria. So I think if you're saying it will accelerate it, that does not bode well. Don, any final thoughts before we shift gears into the second segment?
No. I'm thinking about how the world has changed. Your comment, I wrote it. I'm not usually a Dugin aficionado, but he wrote a very provocative article this week.
Dugin?
Celebrating the collapse of the West, but he didn't have much to say about Russia, except he wasn't sure. But we'll talk about
the collapse of the West as a result of COVID.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in another show.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't seen that. I'll have to read that. All right, well, on that note, we'll shift gears in a few moments. We will continue our discussion and shift gears away from COVID-19 to take a closer look at a new report on Russian public opinion that just so happens to have been co-authored by one of our guests. Gee, I wonder who that is. I'd like to remind you are listening to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining me from his home in Alexandria, Virginia, where I hear there's a lovely old town, is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Also joining us from just down the street from me in lovely DuPont Circle after escaping from Cleveland, Ohio, is Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. I'd also like to remind you can subscribe to the Power Vertical Podcast on iTunes. You could read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at SIPA.org, and you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. this week, SIPA published a report co-authored by our very own Maria Snegovaya titled Society's View of Doing Business in Russia. And this is part of a three-part project SIPA has been doing in conjunction with the Levada Center, looking at modernizing trends in Russian society. The report is the first in a three-part series. Subsequent reports will look at attitudes toward the rule of law and about civic activism among Russian youth. Maria, I'm just going to hand the microphone over to you right now and just give us your top line findings.
Thank you very much, Brian, for this opportunity. And I wanted also to mention that Don, who is also today with us on this podcast, has certainly did a fantastic job editing this report, and without him, it wouldn't have been the same by far. So this project has been started as an effort by SIPA and Russia's most reputable independent polling company, Levada Center.
I would argue only a reputable polling company.
Well, there's, to be fair, there's a couple more smaller ones, but Levada is the biggest one and definitely the most reliable. As an effort to understand the trends within the Russian society. So we tend to talk about how bad the political system is and the Russian elites, but it's what I think commonly escapes from the Western debate and discussions of Russia is that there's actually a society that underneath these political structures that keeps developing and modernizing, if you wish, despite, unfortunately not because of, but despite the very traditionalist political structures that actually try to constrain these developments and trends. This is the first one in this series of three reports. All of them actually came out quite interesting, so I'm hoping that we'll keep publishing them soon. Here we focus specifically on the attitudes towards entrepreneurs and business more broadly, because it's commonly, Russia is still commonly perceived as a country that came out of this communist past with this inherited suspicion against the market, the businessman. And so we actually show that's definitely not true anymore. We find that, as a matter of fact, this year, the positive attitudes toward businesses has actually peaked throughout the all times of Levada's observations, with over 80% of respondents thinking that small and medium enterprises actually benefit the country. And there's a little bit less, about like 60% of respondents who think the same about big businesses. And in addition, it's very important that when we asked our respondents to name professions where most talented and most brilliant people work, they also very highly ranked businessmen. In fact, they mentioned them as actually only second after scholars, I believe. So this actually tells you that the society is developing and the attitudes towards businessmen, the entrepreneurs, has actually improving. And that also shows that there is a deepening divide between these people in the society who think so. And these are especially, this is especially true of younger, better off, more educated respondents, and especially those who live in Moscow as well. But this actually shows you that there is a deepening divide between them and the ruling elites who don't feel the same about businessmen. For example, in his recent interview, Putin essentially described entrepreneurs and businessmen as crooks. And that's, of course, very telling because he's someone who beliefs formed throughout the Soviet times, who really has never worked in business, and who is representative of this kind of Soviet/Russian nomenclature that actually is quite hostile to grassroots mobilization and to the businessman activity. So this is the key takeaway, but I'm happy to talk about it more.
Yeah, no, I'm going to press you a little bit because I'm going to press you on the same contradictions in the findings that I noticed that we brought up in our virtual launch event just 2 days ago at SIPA. The reports, of course, they find that Russians have a high opinion of entrepreneurs, and this is particularly pronounced among the young and the educated, as you said, and that these are the highest levels that we've seen of approval of business people since Levada started asking this question 16 years ago. But on the other hand, the trust in the business sector is actually lower than any other public or political institution. The army, the president, security services, and the church, for example. And moreover, the most respected Russian business people that respondents named were state-connected oligarchs, not your self-made businessmen and women that kind of created their own enterprise on the backs of their own talents, but effectively people that are seeking rents from the state budget. On the other hand, there was another contradiction I noticed. I thought this is just very interesting stuff in the data. This is no criticism of the research. I just think the data is really interesting. Only 14% of Russians have experience running their own business, and that number is actually declining. So the numbers of Russians, they're effectively voting with their feet in the wrong direction here. Because as they kind of hold business people in higher esteem, less and less people are starting their own business. And just about a quarter of the population says they'd like to open their own business. 3/4 of them found it too difficult because of the business environment, because of problems like corruption and the unjust prosecution of business people. So I was wondering if you could address that, and I want to bring Don into the discussion as well.
So thank you very much, Brian. These are very important points for sure. And I just have to start by saying that any public opinion is contradictory in a lot of ways, right? Because we're kind of trying to capture this moving average across different groups and different groups with different formative experiences, different attitudes, beliefs, and interests. And so, of course, by definition, there will be contradictions. In the Russian case, however, this is also exacerbated by this good old tradition of double thinking. So people actually are more likely to embrace contradictory viewpoints at the same time. I think to answer the first question, so why, despite the generally positive views of businesses, especially small and medium-sized businesses, Russians actually tend to show much higher levels of confidence in state institutions, such as the president, the Russian Orthodox Church, and even security services. And also, why do they primarily name state-linked, state-connected businessmen when asked to name a few most respected, exemplary businessmen? So to me, for example, that is a reflection of what the information they get, our respondents get from the state TV channels. I think that's in a lot of ways, these polls actually are indicative, unfortunately, of the TV coverage. And of course, on those in the news, they primarily hear about this great work done by security services, the great things that the president does, and as well as about the state presidents. I'm sorry, state-connected businessmen. If you actually dig into the data, we notice that those, if our respondents actually mentioned some non-state-linked businessmen, that would typically be the businessmen whose names were in the news back in 2000s, when the media landscape was freer in Russia, and so there was just more opportunities for those people to hear about those, such as, for example, Evgeny Chechvarkin, Pavel Durov, or Michael Khodorkovsky, all free, unfortunately. Very
don't live in Russia anymore.
Don't live in Russia anymore, exactly, and we know why, and there's a really good reason why. So I think actually it's just a reflection of the media landscape, where people tend to name what they hear more often about, without really analytically trying to digest this information and actually try to make the views more consistent. And the second question, why we see so few people who are willing to engage in business activities, and actually the numbers unfortunately declining over the years, despite positive view of businessmen overall. This is completely rational. I mean, if you live in Russia, or if you hear anything about Russia's economic situation, I mean, who am I to blame you for not really willing to engage into business activities? The economic situation is very bad. It actually has been stagnating pretty much since more or less 2008, definitely after Crimea annexation. And there's huge outflow of the investment. And this is also exacerbated by consistent attacks by state-linked agencies in multiple security structures, for example, on independent businessmen in an effort to extort more bribes. Unless you have a certain kind of protection racket, in the state, you are not likely to run your successful business for a very long time. So these are all the factors that definitely disincentivize people from doing business, even if a lot of them used to consider that. As of now, about a quarter of population say they would like to open their business. They just say that, right? That very few of them would do that. This is as compared to about 2/3 in the United States, for example, just to give you the idea of how many people are lost as a result of this state policies.
It was interesting you mentioned Pavel Durov, the founder of Kontakte, which is basically the Russian Facebook, which he was forced to sell to Kremlin-connected entities, and the founder of Telegram, which is basically the Russian WhatsApp, which he still owns. But when Pavel Durov, who is an entrepreneur, I mean, Pavel Durov he meets every definition of an entrepreneur. This is somebody that built a business from scratch using his own talent, was not seeking rents from the state, and in fact was doing so despite the hostility of the states and the state money. But he had to leave, and when he left, I thought this was so telling. He put an ad on social media saying, "I'm looking for a new country. I'm an entrepreneur who's willing to work and create jobs and pay taxes and be a good corporate citizen. I'm in the market for a country." And so, I mean, I thought that was really telling. Don, I want to bring you in here because you edited this, and I know you got a lot of thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, first of all, I recommend it highly for people listening, and it's very rich. Many things one could comment on, and the first one, let me pick two. The first one is that this issue of the amount of state-controlled or run businesses in Russia compared to most countries, I find very interesting. And I think when I habitually think about this problem, I tend to project incorrectly the fact that entrepreneurship goes on or should go on or might go on in Russia the way it does here. And actually, many of the Western democracies don't have anywhere near, except maybe France, have anywhere near the state control over a large swath of the economy that Russia does. And Maria, can you say more of that to our audience? And second, I was very pleased, Brian, you quoted my old idol, Richard Pipes, about the patrimonial issue, because all of Maria's and Levada's great findings present a very intractable policy issues. How do you separate power and money? How do you strengthen the rule of law? These are really long-term projects, and I'm at a loss to come up with anything that would work anytime soon without letting bunch of USAID-funded institutions go back in. So 2 issues. One is the issue of the amount of state-run industry. Does that mean entrepreneurship is seen the same way, Maria, as it is elsewhere? Or am I misinterpreting your findings? And second, the issue of power and money, which seem to be as mixed together as kasha and very hard to separate.
Yeah, that's a great question, Maria. Just to add to that, I mean, like
Maria's going to answer for everybody right now.
Back to the notion of like people naming these state-connected oligarchs as entrepreneurs, and this I mean, a state-connected oligarch is the opposite of an entrepreneur. And if people are naming the likes of Timchenko and Sechin as entrepreneurs, if those guys are entrepreneurs, I'm an Olympic triathlete. All right, I mean, it's just. But go ahead, Maria.
Thank you so much for great questions, Dan and Brian. Unfortunately, I don't know to what extent I'm able to fully address those issues, but I will try. So first of all, there's definitely a lot of confusion among Russians about what entrepreneurship is. And unfortunately, our poll, which was actually a face-to-face interviews run as an addendum to Levada's monthly omnibus polls. These big, large-scale quantitative polls that in a lot of ways very shallow. They don't allow addressing in depth how respondents really understand the entrepreneurship. But mostly the question actually didn't just ask about entrepreneurship. They also ask about businessmen. And so it's important to kind of say that in different answers and different questions, people would still actually more or less provide very related, similar answers to the questions. So what we find is that, in fact, people understand very well that in Russia, it's hard to do business without state connections or certain type of state support. So even if they tend to value individual level activities more, or like grassroots activities more. So that is evident by the fact that small and medium enterprise attitudes toward small and medium enterprises and entrepreneurs who run those businesses, they actually always are higher levels than attitudes towards large businessmen. Large businessmen are, it seems from the polls, come out actually as these guys that are connected to Putin and this in the state-owned corporations and whatnot, and so they're not necessarily as good and as independent, as well achieved as lower level entrepreneurs are. At the same time, actually, people are not. They understand that the state is providing a lot of bad things. They do mention they are quite familiar with these instances of attacks and raiders against entrepreneurs. But at the same time, given the institutional setup in Russia that actually only allows you to succeed in business if you have some kind of state protection cover, our respondents are quite rational. So they mentioned that they would love to have that in one way or another. So that is demonstrated by, for example, the fact that people consistently mentioned the need for state support. And whatever you can mean by that, they can mean by this state support.
If I can interrupt for a moment, Marie, when they mention that, do they mention that like this is a bad thing, or that this is just how it is and it's neither bad nor good?
State support is a good thing, and it's a necessary thing
so people
for them.
Consider that to be a good thing.
That's a good thing. That's a necessary thing for them to successfully run their business, along with the availability of funding. That actually is consistently found in the polls. In a lot of ways, it's also a legacy, of course, of this somewhat paternalistic demands of the population, where anything if you want to do whatever you want to do, you always need some kind of state support. At the same time, there is a large awareness about how deleterious the actions of state-linked siloviki or different agencies, state-linked agencies are. There is high levels of awareness about the persecution of independent entrepreneurs. And there is definitely awareness that the siloviki and these other state-linked agencies actually acting on selfish motives. So I actually tend to think of it as some kind of institutional trap in which people understand that the state actually is not benevolent. In a lot of ways, the state is composed of malevolent actors that are out there to get you if you're a successful businessman. But because the conditions on the ground are such that you need some kind of state cover and protection if you want to be remotely successful, you can help but still want some state support. And those are, of course, the conditions that are purposefully created by the Kremlin so that everyone in one way or another is dependent on them. Nobody is totally independent. Nobody is totally in opposition-minded, so to speak. So we are witnessing a very, very contradictory set of beliefs where there's definitely modernizing trends, but at the same time, unfortunately, there's a lot of obstacles essentially put to development of these independent activities by the conditions on the ground. Denis Volkov, my co-author, he actually called the situation so-called curved mirrors, where people actually tend to adopt a set of double standards with the correct attitudes towards leading public players. And that's unfortunately what we find. But again, what can you expect in a complicated, political realities is the ones found in Russia.
Great, thanks. No, I'd highly recommend everybody read this report. And actually, Marie, we've got a few minutes left, and I just wanted to give you a chance to preview. This is not the last. This is just the first of a 3-part series. The other 2 parts aren't written yet, of course, but I assume you've seen the data. Can you give us any hints about what we should expect in the report on rule of law and the report on youth attitudes towards activism?
Yes, thanks a lot, Brian. So the second report actually asks Russians about their attitudes toward the rule of law, to what extent they think and they believe that the authorities, abide to the rule of laws, what issues primarily do they face with the rule of law in Russia, etc., etc. Once again, it's a quantitative study, so we couldn't really, unfortunately, dig into depth about what Russians perceive as rule of law, but certainly ask people about questions. To what extent do you think that the authorities abide the laws they create, etc., etc.? And what we find very briefly is that people who are not experienced with how legal institutions work in Russia, they seem to have much higher opinion of the rule of law in Russia as opposed to those who actually have certain experience.
So there's an inverse correlation between knowledge about how the rule of law works and faith. That's very interesting.
That's very interesting. And the third report in the series is the one that focuses specifically on the youth. We expect this one to be of the largest interest to our audience because it addresses the major question to what extent the youth in Russia represents its future in terms of its civic activism, how different it is from the rest of the population, and what are the characteristics of the younger Russians who are more civically active. And we actually find that, of course, first of all, the internet, of course, internet access strongly correlates with civic attitudes, but we also find that experience of, openness, awareness about what's going on in the West, or the people who travel more, who speak different languages and who are more active online, those are exactly the people who also tend to be civically active. And because we see, as we have discussed in the past, that trends actually are deepening in the Russian society, more and more people travel, more and more people actually are online and they trust the internet more, we actually may envision that these trends will, in the long term, translate into certain type of social change as well.
Hey, thank you, Maria. Just to remind our listeners, the report is called Society's View on Doing Business in Russia. It's co-authored by Maria Snegovaya, Denis Volkov, and Stepan Goncharov of the Levada Center. It is available at the SIPA website, www.sipa.org, and we will provide a link to it in this podcast. If you're listening to this podcast off the SIPA website, we will provide a link. Don, last word to you before we call it a week.
No, I remember among the other publications that came out this week, Catherine Belton's book about Putin, and he's talking about the Russian oligarchs, and it's on the subject Maria just discussed with the rest of us. And I had a conversation with somebody, a former Russian official, a few years ago, asking about the Brooklyn basketball team and the Russian oligarch who bought it. And she paused and she said, "Well, you have to understand it's all Putin's money."
So Putin owns the Brooklyn Nets, is what you're saying.
Yeah, he allows you to buy things. And I think in Catherine's book, she talks about the purchase of the British soccer team. Was it Arsenal or whatever it was?
No, I'm looking forward. Catherine's an old colleague of mine.
Yeah, exactly.
So I want to take a look at that book. All right, well, that just about wraps it up. That's all we have time for today. I'd like to remind you have been listening to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, Director of the Russia Program at SIPA. Joining me from his home in lovely Alexandria, Virginia, with its beautiful old town, has been former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, Senior Fellow and Editor-in-Chief at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. And also joining us from just down the street from me in DuPont Circle, after escaping miraculously from Cleveland, Ohio, has been Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins. Thank you both for an enlightening discussion.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
Have a nice weekend yourself. I'd also like to thank our producer, Michal Harmata, for patiently keeping all the lights on and all the complicated machines well-oiled, socially distanced, and sanitized in working order throughout our discussion. I'd also like to remind you can subscribe to the Power Vertical Podcast on iTunes. You can read the Power Vertical blog and watch the vertical video at sipa.org, and you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Join us again next week. Keep washing your hands, keep socially distancing, stay home, observe all state and local health guidelines and federal guidelines. And now, as always, I leave you with something other than the ambient sounds of my favorite socially conscious Russian rapper, Noise MC.